Just like any great movie or book, the story is the heart of professional wrestling. And the beautiful thing is, it doesn't have to be complicated. Take the simplest version, for example. There's a good guy and there's a bad guy. The villain is the evil boss, the most powerful man in the company. The hero is a foul-mouthed, beer-drinking rebel who simply refuses to take orders. Every week, the villain tries to fire him, humiliate him, bury him. Every week, the hero gets back up and hits him with a stunner. That's Austin versus McMahon. And that simple story of a rebel versus a corrupt boss didn't just entertain people. It saved WWE from going bankrupt and turned it into the biggest wrestling company on the planet. Or how about a supernatural story? Let's take a mythical figure who can rise from caskets, appear out of thin air, and has cast a shadow of fear over the entire locker room for years. But then one day, a secret is revealed. His younger brother, a brother he believed had died in a fire during their childhood, is alive. And not only is he alive, but it's alleged that it was the older brother himself who caused that fire. Now the younger brother, a monster forged in flames, has come back for revenge. That's Kane and The Undertaker. A supernatural horror story told inside a wrestling ring that became a core memory for millions around the world. Or take a story about two best friends. The first friend is the biggest star in the company, a cocky rock star who parties hard but can back up every word when that bell rings. The second friend is more grounded and for years has stood loyally by his side. But then a freak accident puts the first friend on the shelf for 4 years. And while he's gone, the second friend rises to the top. He marries the boss's daughter, becomes one of the most powerful men in the company, and by the time the first friend finally returns, everything has changed. On the surface, it looks like a reunion, but underneath, the second friend can't escape the feeling that he'll always be second, no matter how powerful he becomes. That resentment, that jealousy, that unspoken hatred between two men who used to be brothers turns into one of the most brutal and emotionally compelling stories ever told. That's HBK versus Triple H in 2002. And it worked because you understood exactly who these people were and why the betrayal hurt. These are the stories that made WWE what it is. Not the matches themselves, but the stories behind those matches. Today, the production is more polished than ever. Wrestlers are more athletic than ever. There are heel turns and retirement angles and premium live events stacked back to back. But somehow, through all of that, the soul of the story has gone missing. You watch a show, and 2 days later, you can barely remember what happened. And to understand why this happened, we have to take a quick trip down memory lane and understand the evolution of storytelling in WWE. In the beginning, the stories were simple. An American hero against a foreign villain. Hulk Hogan, arms spread wide and muscles gleaming, standing across the ring from the Iron Sheik or Nikolai Volkov while the crowd went absolutely nuclear. These storylines weren't subtle. They weren't layered. They didn't need to be, because the wrestlers themselves were such overwhelming physical spectacles that the story almost wrote itself. Hogan was a walking symbol of everything the crowd wanted to believe in. His opponents were everything they wanted to hate. The formula was simple and it worked, but it also started to evolve. Towards the late 80s and early 90s, the stories began getting more personal. You had the love triangle between Hogan, Miss Elizabeth, and Randy Savage. It was about a man convinced that his friend was trying to take his woman. That personal dimension gave the story an emotional weight that the hero versus foreign villain formula never quite reached. However, the core focus during the golden era remained on good versus evil and bodybuilder physiques. But then the steroid trial happened, and wrestling stories changed overnight. The era of larger-than-life bodybuilder wrestlers was suddenly a liability. The company pivoted quickly. Wrestling became faster, more technical, and the focus shifted toward in-ring performance. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels led that transition, and they were arguably the best pure wrestlers the company had ever seen. But something was missing. The characters weren't connecting. The ratings slid. The arenas started emptying. Bret and Shawn were brilliant athletes, but the audience didn't have the same emotional investment they'd had in Hogan or Savage or Warrior. The stories felt smaller, even when the wrestling was better. But then, on a cold night in Montreal in November 1997, everything changed. Bret Hart got screwed out of the title by his own boss in front of the world. And whether it was fully real or carefully orchestrated, the lines between reality and fiction collapsed completely. Vince McMahon, who had spent over a decade hiding behind the curtain as a simple announcer, stepped into the light as the villain. The Mr. McMahon character was born, and within months, he had found his perfect foil in Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Attitude Era that followed was a complete reinvention of what wrestling stories could be. Austin wasn't a clean-cut hero. He drank beer, broke rules, and gave his boss the finger every single week. McMahon wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a man who understood power and used it without apology. And that complexity spread across the entire roster. The Rock was simultaneously arrogant and irresistible. Triple H was a cerebral, ruthless political animal. Mankind was a broken, sympathetic lunatic. These weren't good guys and bad guys anymore. They were people, flawed, complicated, and fascinating people that you couldn't take your eyes off. The stories matched that complexity. Triple H and Kurt Angle went to war over Stephanie McMahon in a feud that mixed in-ring action with psychological tension. Austin and The Rock feuded repeatedly, and each chapter added new layers to both characters. Everyone on that roster had a defined personality, a clear motivation, and a reason for you to care about what happened to them. The Ruthless aggression era pushed storytelling even further into personal territory. Championship matches were almost secondary to the human conflicts driving them. Eddie Guerrero and Rey Mysterio, two close friends, found themselves on opposite sides of a custody battle over Rey's own son, Dominic. Batista turned on Triple H not just over a title, but over years of accumulated disrespect from a mentor who never truly saw him as an equal. Randy Orton and The Undertaker played out a generational war between a cocky young prodigy and a legend who refused to die. These stories worked because they were about real emotions like loyalty, betrayal, disrespect, all things audiences understood and felt in their own lives. Then came the PG era, and stories began blurring with reality. Daniel Bryan's journey is one of the most remarkable stories WWE has ever told, partly because it wasn't entirely fictional. The audience genuinely believed that management was holding Bryan back in real life, and that belief supercharged every single moment of his on-screen underdog story. When he stood with both titles raised above his head at WrestleMania 30 after defeating The Authority, 65,000 people celebrated together because it felt like a real victory over a system that had tried to keep a man down. Around the same time, 3 men in riot gear marched to the ring, attacked everything in sight, and the Shield was born. What made their story so compelling over the following years wasn't just their dominance. It was watching 3 talented individuals grow simultaneously, in real time, often at each other's expense. Seth Rollins became the most hated man in the company the moment he took a chair and broke the Shield. Dean Ambrose descended into beautiful chaos, and Roman Reigns began the slow, painful process of becoming the face of the company. Their individual arcs stretched across years and dominated WWE's stories from 2014 to 2018. And then came the bloodline. Roman Reigns, reborn as the tribal chief, built a faction rooted in Samoan family tradition, loyalty, and the weight of legacy. The story had everything: power dynamics, sibling rivalry between the Usos, the desperate hunger for approval, Sami Zayn's integration into the family, and eventually, the volcanic fallout. It was, by all accounts, absolute cinema. It rewarded long-term viewers while remaining accessible enough to pull in new ones. And then, at WrestleMania 40 in 2024, Cody Rhodes finished his story. A 2-year journey that began with his return at WrestleMania 38, wound through sacrifice and a promise made to his father. It all came to a head in front of 70,000 people in Philadelphia. When Cody pinned Roman Reigns and finally won the title that had eluded him his entire career, it was one of the most emotionally satisfying moments in wrestling history. That was the last time WWE's storytelling truly delivered something special. And in the 2 years since, the landscape has gone strangely quiet. We've got heel turns, retirements, returns, and yet the moments haven't landed. The stories haven't stuck. It feels like WWE has completely forgotten how to tell stories. So what actually went wrong? You see, a story is only as powerful as the characters living inside it. You care about Batman because you know exactly who he is before he puts the mask on. A young boy watches his parents get shot dead in front of him in a dark alley, and that single moment of helplessness defines everything he becomes. His obsession with justice, his refusal to use a gun, his inability to truly let anyone in, it all traces back to that one night. That backstory is what makes him Batman. Without it, he's just a rich guy in a cape. Superman came from a dying planet, sent away by parents who loved him enough to save him, even though they couldn't save themselves. He grew up different, isolated, hiding what he was capable of because the world wasn't ready. Spider-Man was a nerdy, awkward kid who couldn't get a date, and his failure to stop a petty criminal directly led to his uncle's murder. He has to live with that every single day. The backstories, the fears, the motivations, that's what makes you invest. That's what makes you care when these worlds collide. Now let's apply the same concept to wrestling. John Cena spent almost 2 decades telling you to never give up. That was his entire identity. The guy who absorbed punishment, who got knocked down repeatedly, who should have tapped out 100 times and kept getting back up because giving up simply wasn't in him. That consistency, maintained over years and years of television, is what made his heel turn and his retirement so polarizing. When Cena finally acknowledged that his body was done, that he had nothing left to give, the emotion in that moment came directly from 2 decades of character investment. The Undertaker was a mythical figure who could not be beaten at WrestleMania. That story ran for over 2 decades, 21 consecutive victories, each one adding another layer to a legend that felt genuinely untouchable. And when Brock Lesnar finally ended the streak in 2014, the silence that fell over the Superdome in New Orleans wasn't just shock, it was grief. WWE had spent 20 years making you believe in something, and in that moment, they let it die. It hit so hard precisely because the character had been protected and developed and respected for so long. Now think about the current roster. Pick any name outside of the top 2 or 3 guys on the top of the card. Tell me who they are as a person. Tell me what they want more than anything. Tell me what they're afraid of. Tell me what line they would never cross, and what would finally make them cross it. For most of the current roster, you can't answer those questions. Not because the performers aren't talented, but because the company has never bothered to ask them either. Sit through any episode of Raw or SmackDown today, and what you'll find is a roster full of people who all want the same thing. They want to be the best wrestler. They want to prove they can wrestle more matches and do more flips and holds than anyone else on the roster. They cut promos about how hard they've worked and how much they deserve it. But that's not a character that makes you care. That's a job description. The fundamental problem isn't effort or talent. The problem is that building a character the way WWE used to build characters requires 3 things: time, patience, and the willingness to let a story breathe. Look at what happens to the stories today. A feud starts, the crowd begins investing, and then 3 weeks later, it's over. A character turn happens, and championships change hands overnight with no build. Storylines get quietly dropped and never referenced again. Nothing is allowed to become legendary, because legendary requires the one thing that a money-hungry television model simply won't sacrifice: time. Vince McMahon understood the importance of investing time in the characters and stories. He kept John Cena as a babyface for years, even as crowds turned on him, even as arenas full of adults booed him out of the building every single night. A lesser promoter would have turned Cena heel immediately to chase the approval of the loudest voices in the room. McMahon held the line. And that stubbornness, that willingness to protect a long-term vision over short-term crowd reaction is what made Cena's character iconic. That's what made his heel turn shocking. That's what made it hurt when he tapped out in his last match. That kind of thinking is almost entirely absent from wrestling in 2026. And here's the thing. Audiences today are smarter than they've ever been. We all know wrestling is predetermined. Nobody is sitting at home wondering who the best wrestler is. So trying to cut promos about doing the best moves and working the most matches isn't enough anymore. What draws people in now is the same thing that draws them into any great television series or any great film: a character they understand and a story they're invested in. Give us a character with a backstory. Give them something specific to want. Give them a rival who represents everything they're fighting against. Then get out of the way and let that story develop over months, not weeks. Trust that the audience will come with you if you give them something worth following. That's how you make stars. That's how you create the moments people talk about for the next 20 years. That's how you revive WWE and make it great again. Not with more pyro, not with stadium shows, not with celebrity appearances that generate a day's worth of social media buzz, but with stories told with conviction and patience, which can be something as simple as a rebel babyface versus a corrupt, evil boss.